Cloud. All right, welcome everybody. Well, this is it. We have come to the end of this semester. Wow. Gracias a Dios. We're at the end. That's it. So today, there's a couple of things you might notice. I put in the participation in the syllabus. It says it's 15 points, and I have no idea how to measure it. So I'm just giving everybody 100. Forgetting about it. That's it. So if your grade's lower, you probably went up about 3 points or 4 points. If you're already in an A, it probably have inconsequential difference on your grade. I do have that in the syllabus, and because it's in there, I need to honor that. So we have that. The second idea, I made an announcement. I don't make many announcements, but the final exam will focus on psycholinguistics. There's roughly 12 or 15 questions in there. Some of the questions are matching, which means the question breaks them into 6 smaller questions, or 3 or 4 smaller questions. But that's what that is. Everything I talk about today, we're going to dabble a little bit into sociolinguistics, but I'm not going to cover that on the final exam. Wednesday, we'll do a final exam review with some practice questions. And whenever you're ready, the final exam is open with the respondents lockdown browser plus the webcam. I said in the announcement, I think we're scheduled to be here. I put 7:30 p.m. in the syllabus. That's a mistake. It's 7:30 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. You got 2 hours, right? So anybody who cannot take the exam using the browser, if it doesn't work for you, you already know that, then you want to show up next Monday at 7:30. You want to show up on that day, and you can just bring your computer in here and take it at that point. That would be your best strategy. After that, all bets are off. Finals begin, there's no office hours, none of that. So we want to get everything finished as quickly, as efficiently as we can. By Monday of next week, I want to tie up all the loose ends to this class. I'll start submitting grades at my Coyote and on and on and on, right? Remember that a lot of us, we have 5 different courses we're teaching because it's a semester thing. So some of our final exams are earlier in the week, others are later like you. So when we have something done, then we try to wrap that up and finish that and move on to another course. So that's kind of what's going on there. It's open all the way until December 6th, 11:59 p.m. Any questions on that? Yes.
It opens today, and then it's open from today till next Monday.
Yeah, I opened it yesterday even.
Okay.
Yeah, it's open today all the way until next Monday. So I want to make sure you guys have plenty of time. You can pick a time that works for you. In my opinion, based on what you guys have done so far, I'd plan on anywhere from 20 to 45 minutes. If you want to block a time, you're a mother, some of you, this and that. So if you have somebody send your kids to a movie, there it is. You can do it at that point, right? You have to kind of plan it out and see what works for you, and you got flexibility to figure out when you want to do that. And then Monday of next week, hopefully anybody who has not been able to take it needs to take it in class next Monday. Okay, there we go. So we're going to get into sociolinguistics just a little bit. And let's go over to here. Okay, got it. Okay, let me share my screen here. This down too. It's kind of like the name of it. You can socio, society, linguistics, language, the study of the interrelationship between society and language. That would be a general description of it. And then underneath that, you can look at all kinds of kind of neat things. An area I look at in my 3060 class is gender differences with language. So there's a lot of theories out there that men and women are different culturally. They're kind of talked to, they're raised different culturally, they grow up differently, even if they're in the same household, and they look at talk and view talk differently and the role that it plays in long-term relationships. So you could even look at that. That would be an area of sociolinguistics. go here. Let's share our screen. Okay, here we go. And my son was actually asking me about this the other day about dialects and language. And it depends on where you're situated. If you're in England or you're in Europe, you have all these small countries that have borders, and you have like a version of Spanish versus a version of French. There's kind of something in the middle there. What do you call that, right? So we have these, what's called dialects versus language, right? That would be one thing that we would look at in sociolinguistics. And how do we differentiate the two? So dialects we typically associate with areas or groups within a country. You have language would be associated with a particular people within a country. You have dialect as one form of a language. You have language is the larger whole. And then dialects may have negative connotations. It is often associated with the substandard form of the language. If you interview people, just a lot of people that in many cases they're ignorant about a lot of things, unfortunately, but you ask them about English or what's the best way to speak it and so on, everybody's got their opinion. If you, we don't have time to do it here, but if you go to YouTube, you can check out different excerpts from a video called American Tongues. And they did that. They actually interviewed people and they said, well, you know, what form of English? Well, we speak the standard form of English, right? They would say that in Northern Ohio. Then they go to Southern Ohio and they claim that they speak the standard form. You go to New York, they say they do. You go to the South, they claim they do. And you go to California, everybody thinks they're speaking the standard form of the language. But the fact is there are different dialects. You have language here. We usually associate with writing and literary traditions. A dialect is only spoken and does not have literary traditions. However, there are writers that when they write, I know William Faulkner did this, Maya Angelou did it from time to time. They would, when they included quotes from people, they included how they said it or how they would say it based on where it was the setting of the story and things. So if your characters are from Mississippi, you know, you're going to be using a lot of multiple negations. I ain't never done that. No how, no way. How many negatives is that? I ain't never done that. No how, no way. That's quintuple, or that's quadruple negation right there. That's 4 negatives in a row. So depending on where you are, will depend on the way that we communicate. There's a criterion. How do we separate a dialect from a language, or at one point does a dialect become a different language? So the criterion here would be what's called the mutual intelligibility rule. So ability to be understood by both speakers. So if the dialect can be understood by pretty much everybody within that country, we would call that the same language. If the answer is no, then maybe it's time to call it a different language. There's problematic issues with this rule. At one point in the language chain, can we say that one language ends and another language begins? So if you look at some examples here, you have New England versus Australian, right? The way that they speak up in New England area versus Australia, that would be pretty far on the language continuum, right? You're getting really, the vocabulary is going to be different, the grammar will be different, and some of those things. When I went to college, I was with Ian Matheson, who came from, I'm going to say Aberdeen, Scotland, and I came from Mississippi. So we had a few scraps and fights and arguments, and we didn't understand each other exactly, and it took some time to figure things out. He would say things that I never said, like I'm shattered, and then I'm really tired after a 10-mile run or something. But I mean, he was speaking English. I mean, I knew he was speaking, but I didn't know exactly what he was meaning by a lot of the words he used, and he had trouble understanding some of what I was saying. And so there was some friction. and some things going on there. We're both cross-country and track runners competing, to be on the team. We had scholarships and all that stuff. And so you got that alpha male kind of thing going on. But we were very different in our dialects of English is the bottom line, right? So it says, if you look at rural dialects of Portuguese, Spanish, Catalan, French, and Italian, maybe there's a dialect of Portuguese, it's understandable in a dialect to Spanish, or there's some dialects of Spanish which are understandable to Catalan or French or Italian and so on. So there's a lot of gray areas with this. It says, because of cultural or political purposes, two mutual intelligible languages may be considered separate. Danish and Norwegian, for example, they're considered separate languages to make the countries independent from each other, but really they're not. It says, because of political purposes, two unintelligible languages may be considered the same. You have Mandarin and Cantonese, for example. I think Mandarin, I'm going to say there's about 850 million speakers of this language. And then there's probably another about the same as a number of people in the United States. I'm going to say maybe 250 to 300 million Cantonese speakers. And this is in China. And they do not understand each other. People who speak Cantonese do not understand people who speak Mandarin. However, the written language is the same. So you could actually argue that these are different languages, but China does not recognize them as such. And you'll notice in a lot of Chinese television, they'll have the caption underneath. You ever notice that? They'll have the caption and they'll write everything down. So whether they speak Cantonese or Mandarin, whatever the dialect may be, typically they can understand the written form. So it says here, why would China not recognize these languages as being separate languages? What might be the purpose for that? You have any idea?
Well, the region is very large, so they would have their own individual histories.
Yeah, I think for unity purposes, China wants to create a unified, not divided country. If they recognize, the Cantonese as a separate language, it becomes like it's separate country almost. And they're trying to keep things together. If anything, China, they want Hong Kong back into the fold. They want Taiwan back in there. They want to keep everything united. So if you recognize a dialect as being a different language, which it is, but it could divide the nation in some sense. So I'm saying that there are political reasons, right? There's reasons to not recognize a language to be a separate language. Okay, evolution of regional dialects in the United States. So if you look at the United States as a quilt, right? And there's each sections. And one part of that quilt kind of gradually blends into another part of the quilt, right? But as you go from one part of the quilt to the other part, you go from east to west, or you go north to south, you get different kind of versions of the language. So this is kind of how we have dialects. And historically, depending on how we settled, where we settled, and how people migrated and where they migrated, that all has a big impact on what type of dialect you speak, right? It says here, in this case, we have, regional dialect by definition. It says variation of a language spoken in a particular geographical region. Attitudes and values may be attached to the usage of a dialect. So here are some stereotypes. And we don't want stereotypes, but there are. People have stereotypes about the type of English that you speak. People do. It says Southern English, stereotypes. People are slow and uneducated. New England, stereotypes. People are educated, rich, elite, and snobby. That'll be a stereotype. Australian, stereotypes. People are rugged, laid back, and casual. But just because somebody speaks one of these dialects, it doesn't mean that these things are true, but people have these stereotypes about things. Linguists, we describe what happens in the language. We're not concerned with value judgments. And this is an important point. Linguists view all dialects as being equal complex, systematic, and intelligent. So from a linguistic point of view, there's not really a right or wrong way to speak English, but there's just differences in how people speak it based on where they live, what their socioeconomic level is, and so on and so forth. So if anything, dialects, they take what they, I mean, you could probably defend if you looked at, say, African-American English or Spanish influenced English or Appalachian English, let's say those are some big ones, right? Talking about 50, 60, 70 million speakers, huge number of people. If anything, these dialects, they take these inconsistencies with the language and they take a word like catch, instead of caught, they say catched, right? Or to make something negative, you use more negative words in there to make it stronger. In many cases in dialects, they don't even use the third person S. It's not I walk, you walk, he, she, it walks, and then we walk, they walk. They don't even do that. They'll say I walk, you walk, he walk, they walk, we walk. They'll keep it all the same and remove the third person S to make it more consistent. So with a lot of dialects, the key, it's consistency, to try to make things more, how do I say, easier to learn, to understand. Language evolves and becomes simpler, not more complex, typically. And I think in the English language, one of the things that you will see is the past perfect tense. It's going to die. It will die. It really will. The one I had graduated by 2020, that pretty soon most people, they're just going to say I graduated by 2020. Most of you are already saying that now. And remember that the way that you speak, that drives the grammar and the written form of the language, because you have to look at the spoken language as being the most important part of any language. And many languages have no written form. So the way we speak, that ends up affecting how we write, how we communicate ultimately. So when people are no longer saying whom, and they say who for who and whom, for example, the friend who I spoke to, if you wanted to be standard, you would say the friend whom I spoke to. But a lot of people now, they're saying the friend who I spoke to is a firefighter. They're not even using whom anymore. So all of these things will affect how the language works later on down the line. And from a linguistic point of view, there's nothing unusual. There's nothing surprising if the simple past or the past perfect tense does die out, if the future perfect tense goes, if that object relative pronoun whom disappears from the language, there would be nothing surprising about that, at least from a linguistic point of view. Change is always happening with language. That's a very common thing. It says dialects are an important part of American heritage, representing different regional, social, and ethnic groups. So original immigrants come to a certain region, bring in their language features to that region. For example, people from Southern England, they migrated to New England areas and they brought the R-less dialect, pak the ka. That's how they spoke in certain parts of England. So when they moved here, they continued to speak that way and influenced people that were around them to speak that way. Natural barriers, such as rivers, mountains, oceans, and lakes, cut off a group of speakers from other speakers. The isolation causes a distinct dialect to develop in that area or region. So here is an example here, Appalachian English. There. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples here. And a while back, I watched a YouTube video about Afghanistan. I've been following what's going on over there. And the video was why it cannot be conquered. Nobody has been able to conquer that. The Russians tried in the 80s. We tried to bring democracy for 20 years, didn't work. England 100 years ago or so, they also tried to conquer it, couldn't do it. And one of the things they talked about is there are so many different areas geographically, and you have these, the average altitude in Afghanistan is like 6,000 to 7,000 feet. It's like Big Bear, but that's everywhere. And they got all these areas. And the little bitty passes that go through the areas, and they have an enormous kind of heavy snowfall in the winter. And I think they said there's like 40 or 50,000 miles of paved roads in the whole country only. Doesn't seem, maybe it seems like much, but I think France, which is similar to that, has like 5 million paved roads. So there's just, it's really tough to move around that country. So if you're military and you're going through one of these passes, well, guess what? Everybody's above you raining down missiles and everything else. And you get stuck in these blocked areas and you're a sitting duck. So it's really hard to move things around the country. Now, the other problem is when England drew the boundaries up in England, when England drew the boundaries up in Afghanistan, they separated in the south these, what do they call them? The Pakashis, or you guys know what I'm talking about? There was a certain group of people there that were also in Pakistan, but they're also in southern Afghanistan, and they drew the boundary which separated them. You can't separate a group of people who have the same language and the same culture. So the southern border, they don't even recognize that. People go back and forth at will, because on both sides of the border, they share the same language, the same culture, a lot of the similar things. So you have all these different factions, these different little groups of people. And the farther you get from Kabul, the less effect that Kabul government has on anybody. Imagine if Washington, D.C. was our main government. We had a really, really strong central government. We didn't have all these different states. I mean, how much of an influence would we really feel in California from Washington, D.C.? That's like 3,000 miles away. You see what I'm saying? But that's kind of how the government works. They have like this strong government in Kabul that kind of runs everything, but you get a few hundred miles from the main city there. They call it a city-state. Everybody's doing their own thing anyway. So the languages, the dialects, the different cultures, all of that, it makes it nearly impossible to unite the country all over, everywhere. So even though the Taliban were able to have control, they got control temporarily, but history shows that it's going to just implode into civil war chaos. That's what's going to happen. The Taliban, they'll have control a little bit, but they're not going to be able to maintain it probably for very long. Historically, it suggests that there's no one particular group that can rule all the other groups. Just doesn't seem to work. Okay, let's look at Appalachian English here. And what we're looking at here is we're saying that we don't look at it linguistically. If we look at African American English or Appalachian English or Spanish influenced English, we don't see these as being inherently deficient forms of English. In linguistics, we don't look at it like that. So if we defended it, we would say something like this. We would say Appalachian English is not deficient. It is a variation of the standard form of English. Standard forms of many modern languages use double negatives as well as older forms of English. So the example here would be no tengo nada, or je ne parle pas le français. So you have in both of these languages, in standard Spanish and standard French, double negatives are actually considered acceptable. Shakespeare once said, "I will not budge for no man's pleasure." So even if you go back, if you look at earlier forms of English, double negatives were more common than they are now, at least in standard English. It says the current standard trend of English with double negatives is, it isn't that it is not unimportant. So what we do now is we have a negative and then we have the derivational affix, the un, right? So we put the double negative here to make it, in this case, positive. Number 3, the a prefix on progressive verbs has come full circle. It was common in Middle English during the 12th to 17th century. So here we are using it again. So it is common in Appalachian English to put I am a going to the store or something. They'll put the a in front of it. And we've done it in the past. Ain't was a prestige word in Southern England at the turn of the century. It says in Webster's dictionary, ain't, though disapproved by many and more common in less educated speech, it is used orally in most parts of the US by many educated speakers. You'll hear people use it to make a point. They'll say, I ain't, we ain't. You even educate people will do this sometimes. And if you think about it, I mean, it makes sense maybe why we have the word ain't, but When you use ain't, you can say, I ain't, you ain't, they ain't, we ain't, whatever. So you use ain't every time, but in standard English, you have you are not, you aren't, he is not, he isn't. But then I am not, I amn't. You see the problem there? There's really no way to contract that first person singular. So if you think of it that way, if you use the word ain't, it now allows us, but we use ain't in every case in Appalachian English, but it's a way of contracting that first person singular. I ain't going to the store instead of I am not. So that way you can use a contraction like you can do in the second and the third person forms there. It says, dialect variations can be manifested on 4 major levels. So when you look at dialects, you can look at what we call phonological characteristics. You can look at vocabulary, lexical, and so on. We'll look at a few of them here. So if you look at phonological, for example, a sample of vowel sounds, standard English, you have the epsilon E. It can shift to the capital I. It'll shift. So instead of saying 10, Appalachian English might say 10. There are 10 cars out there in the back, something like that. Or you have the capital I, typically it'll shift to the ash, the at. So think changes to thank. So there are some vowels, right? Some vowel sounds that kind of change in the dialect. You'll see that with, what happens with Spanish influenced English is you'll have the E. You have a, E, O, U, right? You have the basic vowel sounds and they will use those basic vowel sounds in Spanish influenced English. And they won't have the I, like that, it, like in sit. It might be sit instead of sit in Spanish influenced English. Okay, let's look at another one. I'm not going to worry about this. Reversal of sounds. It's called metathesis. So in Appalachian English, and also I think we can say African American English, you have a reversal. So asked becomes axed, or prevail becomes prevail. Instead of album, it's album. So there's some shifting, reversing of certain sounds in there. Word stress, Appalachian English places primary stress on first syllables of certain words, whereas standard English varieties place primary stress elsewhere. So in Appalachian English, you might say Detroit, cigar, directly, November, instead of Detroit, cigar, directly, November, right? So you have some word stress shifts going on. I think that would be another way to identify dialect is the word stress shifts. You have the vocabulary and what's also called the slang. But I think, let me clarify this too. This is important. Slang, it's more of a generational thing that's not passed to the children. A dialect is a form of English which is passed from one generation to another, on and on and on and on. So dialects can be traced back 100, 200, 300 years. But slang, the way that you speak can be slightly different from how your parents speak, right? And they may not, the slang that you use when you speak, you may not pass that to your children. So here's some vocabulary. I pert near got into an accident. I reckon he's a fixing to shoot some deers. My dad burn car done croaked on me. A friend once called me a bug-eyed global brain pea-headed nitwit. So you put a whole bunch of different names or adjectives in there, and the more in there, the merrier. And you have all these ways of insulting somebody if that's what you choose to do. So there's different vocabulary words in there. Morphological features with Appalachian English. You have the A prefix attaches to progressive ing verbs. I was a running one day out in the boondocks. He was a telling me the truth. You see how you have that prefix there? It says too, some irregular stem changing verbs in standard English take the inflectional past tense in Appalachian English. Knowed, drinked, drunk, and catched. So this, and keep in mind, I grew up in Mississippi, right? Now, my parents did not grow up in Mississippi. That's the difference, right? My parents are from New York and Connecticut. My dad got a job in Texas as a plant manager of a furniture company. Eventually, he got promoted, moved to Tupelo, Mississippi. And Mississippi, Tupelo, believe it or not, is one of the largest cities in Mississippi. And at the time, we had 30,000 residents. I think now they're about 60,000. Remember, you got 3 or 4 million people here in the Inland Empire alone. Not to mention LA and the outskirts of that, it's probably another 8 or 9 million. You know what I'm saying? So the whole population of the whole state of Mississippi, where I grew up, I think it's 2 million. So the entire population of Mississippi is half the population of the Inland Empire. But you're looking at Mississippi, if you drive north to south, you're looking at, you know, maybe 8 or 9 hour drive, 10-hour drive, something like that. And then you have the east to west is maybe another 4 or 5 hours that way. So it's just a really not very populated state. Okay, you have others. It says, some irregular stem changing count nouns in standard English take the regular inflectional plural s. So foots, deers, and firemen's. You see the consistency there? And this is not just Appalachian English, but that's the tendency of a dialect is to make the irregular verbs and nouns regular. Make them regular. There's no cacti. There's no syllabi. None of that stuff. They get rid of all those weird things and they try to put the S on the end and make it work that way. So man's instead of men. You know, you have catch instead of caught, all those things. Okay, syntactic features. Okay, double modals. This is probably a very, very, very different from the way you guys speak here. He must have didn't hear me. I might could go to the party. I used to could bowl pretty good. You guys see that? What you guys do here, you'll say, I might be able to. You say the modal and then the paraphrastic modal after that, right? We don't like to say be able to. We don't like that. That's too many words. So we say I might could, and that saves you from having to say I might be able to. So it's very common in the South. And this is even with educated people in the South. They'll use double modals instead of a modal and a paraphrastic modal. Now, even in the South, sometimes, depending on what the socioeconomic status of a person is, I think that the might could, when you're speaking in the South, it really doesn't have much stigma attached to it. But the negations or the multiple negations, sometimes people will have more of an attitude about multiple negation, like I ain't never done that, no how, no way. So there's a lot of educated people in the South. They wouldn't say that, but they would certainly say modals, double modals, things like that. Multiple negation, he ain't never done that kind of thing, or he ain't never done that kind of work before. I ain't never done nothing, no how, no way. 3, 4, that's 5, double negation. Wow. And I think using the word ain't in the South is not stigmatized that much. You'll see a lot of educated and uneducated people together that use it. And I hear ain't out here. So it's not just in the South. Okay. We have Appalachian English characteristics. It says how language is used to carry out social functions. So this is different from you guys. If you move to the South, you beat around the bush. You cannot get to the point too quickly. You should not be too direct. You can't just knock on somebody's door. Are you interested in buying insurance? It doesn't work like that. If you knock on the door, you might talk about the Ole Miss football team and they're playing Louisiana or something. You talk their ear off a little bit. You talk, discuss whatever. Maybe after 15 minutes or so, then you can tell them why you're there, right? but typically you can't be very direct from the start. That was one of the problems my parents had. My parents coming from New York and Connecticut, they're very direct up there. And they just kind of use that similar style when they were in the South. And then finally a good friend of my mom's, Lisa Howell, came, and my mom's name is Scotia. And she said, Scotia, she said, you're not really from around here. That's okay. But you can't just go up to somebody and be too direct with them. You need to be a little bit less direct when you're talking and asking people things and so on. And you'll get along much better down here if you do that. So my parents had to make some adjustments in how they did things. Okay. Okay, so here's one. This is from, what's the guy's name? Jerry Clower. Jerry Clower is a folk storyteller. He talks about hunting and all kinds of different things. And you'll see how you can kind of read it, where he said, when I was growing up, word got out that the best coon hunter in the world was a fellow that lived in East Macomb, Mississippi. And we done sent a word by the mail route, there ain't no coon dog in the world as good as Highball. Don't you ever say or tell nobody that there is. We don't believe it none. You see kind of the different how he's speaking. Well, we got up a little contest. He said, yeah, this fellow will catch more coons in the night's hunt than y'all will. And they're talking about, they do hunting down there, deer hunting, raccoon hunting. It is so serious. They'll have 3 days in the fall for deer hunting. And the kids will go with their parents, they'll go out and shoot deer and stuff. He said, well, we got up a little contest. They said, yeah, this fellow catch more coons on a night's hunt than y'all will. Well, he come a driving, notice that. He come a driving up in his pickup truck to East Fork School, that's where we met. Fellow at the gate down, one of them pickup trucks, there was a Cajun sitting in the back of that pickup truck was a big brown monkey. Marcel said, well, look at that, don't let that thing out. Said he goes, you keep him up in there. He was too much like folks to be getting out of there. You leave him up in that pickup truck. So the guy's bringing, according to the story, I don't believe this story, this guy had some really tall tails. In the South, you didn't just catch a fish. This catfish is so big, it's on a flatbed semi truck and its tail dragging on the dirt on the way out. You know, they tell kind of tall tales. He says, fellow, y'all don't understand. I use a dog with the monkey. I just want one good tree dog. I'll show you how to catch more raccoons. The hides are expensive. I make a good living with that monkey coon hunt. Marcel said, I ain't taking my dog with that trashy thing. Cole said, I'll take old June and we'll go. So all of us followed, and old June hadn't gone very far into a tree. Now, any coon hunter will know that sometimes a raccoon will get up in that tree. He'll tap the tree, go out on a limb, jump out in another tree, go out on a limb, jump into another one, and come out way down yonder. Well, the art of being a good coon dog, you circle around, you make for sure he ain't tapped the tree. And he's up there if you say he's there. Well, June treated to turn that monkey loose, had him on a chain of people. He had a flashlight in his left hand, a pistol in his right hand. Up that tree he went, boogity, 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 right up that tree, went all over that tree, shining that light, had that gun, looking everywhere, out in each limb, shine and shine and shine. And what he did, he'd find a coon to shoot him. The coon falls out. Well, he hadn't found no coon. Down that tree he come, thumb cocked that pistol, put it up to old June's head and said, bloom. Just killed him, graveyard dead right there. Cole said, man, what in the world do you mean? That trashy thing has killed my dog. The fellow went on, the monkey said, he said, Clovis, there ain't but one thing that monkey hates worse than a raccoon. That's a lion coon dog. So that was one of his stories. You can click on it if you want to actually hear him say it right there. You click on that YouTube, and he tells all kinds of stories about his main stories about some family called the Ledbetter family. He tells all kinds of stories about these guys, but you'll hear him when he speaks. He's speaking Appalachian English. It's exactly what it is right there. Okay, what else we want to talk about quickly here? Okay, look at one more. We got about maybe 5 more minutes. African-American English characteristics, phonological features. What's interesting about this dialect is it's not necessarily Appalachian English is something that you'll find exclusively in the Southeast area, right? It kind of originated in the Appalachian Mountains and kind of like throwing a rock into a lake and the ripples, it kind of rippled out into different areas of the Southeast. Appalachian English, of course, the dialect is spoken in the Southeast, but you can go to different cities, Los Angeles, you can go to Las Vegas, you can go around to different areas all over the United States, and you'll see some of the features of what I'm talking about here. Now, you have to be careful, just because somebody is from, say the South, it doesn't necessarily mean they speak Appalachian English, right? Or if somebody's African-American, you can assume that they will speak the dialect, maybe, maybe not, right? Depends on where they grew up and who the parents were and so on and so forth. So it says, we have in African-American English, there is a difference in diphthongs. So the tendency is to get rid of the diphthongs. So instead of town, it's ton, or side, side. So there can be some differences in taking diphthongs and turning them into less complex vowels or monothongs. So that's what's going on there. And sometimes with African-American English, you have the deletion of consonant sounds. So instead of cold, coal, wash, burn, best, there might not be pronunciation of that final consonant sound. That will be another characteristic of this one. Another one would be, and this is also Appalachian English, he need us, she want her, Susan like, my friend prefer. Notice how they're not using in this dialect that third person present singular inflection S. In many dialects, not just African American English, but this would be a feature of that. And then we have another one, syntactic features. The be verb, interesting enough, the be verb is used in African American English, but it's used for a certain purpose. Notice how here, she intelligent, they at the park right now. He at school, Dan a smart student. So in African American English, when you have the be verb as the main verb in there, it's often omitted. As you can see in those examples, that would be. But then, if you look at this, she be at the library almost every day. They be at the park sometimes. He often be at school. He usually would be at his friend's house. So what could we say about when the be verb is used in African American English? What might be the reason? If you look at those examples, remember in the previous ones, we weren't using the be verb at all, right? But yet it seems to be used here. I'll give you a tip. Think about this right here. What does this do?
Telling you when,
Say again?
telling you when.
Yeah, and it's a habitual activity. It's an occurring thing. So if you have, she be at the library, you could probably say she usually goes to the library almost every day, right? So you're talking about a recurring habitual activity that's an ongoing thing. So when the be verb is used in African American English, it's typically used to talk about a habitual activity. That's why you might use it there. That would be the syntactic rule that can be generated from the examples you see here. Okay, what else here we say? Okay, I want to look at those. And then the last one, Spanish influenced English. And if you looked at, I don't know, there's 52 million Spanish speakers. I don't know the exact number on how many speak the Spanish influenced English, but there's millions and millions of people. If you looked at all three dialects, it's millions and tens of millions of people, right? Huge numbers of people. Spanish influenced English, it's gone by a lot of names. Chicano English, you ever heard of that term? Right? I think the term we use right now is Spanish influenced English. And if you looked at phonological features, I think one of the main things on this one is, and remember, interesting enough, is if somebody speaks Spanish influenced English and you kind of hear that Spanish accent in there, it doesn't necessarily mean they speak Spanish, believe it or not. They may not speak any Spanish at all, yet they might speak Chicano English or Spanish voice English, right? So in this case, you have pit changes to pit, or hit is heat, or kitten is kitten. So they have the tendency to eliminate this particular sound because it doesn't exist in Spanish. And they'll use the lowercase I instead of the it. That would be a very, very common feature phonologically. You'll notice that one right there. Syntactic feature, I don't have no money. My father-in-law, his mother, Esther, God rest her soul, she died a few years ago. She was from Mexico, made the best tamales, I mean, and she spoke Spanish mostly, and eventually she spoke English. She spoke English to some extent. And what's interesting is my father-in-law really doesn't speak any Spanish at all. But he uses the double negatives, even with an MBA degree. He still uses those double negatives. And that's a common feature because when Esther, his mom, spoke to him in English, she would use a lot of double negatives. And like I said before, you can use double negatives in Spanish. So that's one of the things I noticed about my father-in-law is remember that using double negatives, it doesn't mean the person is not educated. Like in my father-in-law's case, he's got an MBA degree. I mean, he was the lab director of the hospital out in Hemet for 30 years. He finally retired, and it's taking 5 people to replace what he did. That's how efficient and hard a worker he was in the lab.
Jane Austen did that too. Like she would say, the party was not without its pleasures.
There you go. They never do no homework. He hasn't done no work. So you can see that you have the double negatives here. Lexical features. Saying English words Spanish style and spelling them accordingly is especially common among first-generation English speakers. So vacuum cleaner, boiler, boile, or fast food, maybe fast food, or muggers, holdaperos. You might hear troque, el pickup, la policía me dio un tiquete. You know, things like that. You might use some words sound similar, right? That would be, I don't know, what do you call that? Code switching, maybe? Okay, so you have some of that. Okay, yeah, code switching, a flexible colloquial mixture of Spanish and English is entering mainstream. You will see that a lot. What else? Okay, I think that's good enough there. So I think that's all I'm going to talk about today. So the main thing is with dialects, that would be one area is to look at the regional dialects. And big 3 would be Appalachian English, African American English, and Spanish fluent English. These are probably 3 of the biggest dialects. And sometimes you get down to, if you ever watched Magnum PI, you ever watched that? Way back when? The one guy spoke Boston Brahmin. He sounded like he was from England, but he wasn't. There's a group of very, very small number now. Maybe they're already dead. They may not exist anymore, but there's a group of speakers in Boston area that spoke a very formal form of British English. They weren't even from Britain. They called it Boston Brahmin, a type of English that was very common there. I guess that's it. So then it looks like on Wednesday, I'll just kind of go over what's going to be on the test. If you don't need to know, don't worry about it. The test is open. Take it when you're ready. Remember that we need to tie all loose ends up by next Monday. Let's get everything finished. It's all done. I put in some points for your participation. We got that done. As far as I can tell, I have all the grades. Everything is done. That's another thing though. Next Monday, if you have questions about your grade, you can pop in by Zoom or come by in person. We can talk about it. That's a legitimate reason to talk to me, right? Maybe I forgot something. You did the test, but I didn't see it. I missed it. You got to point out these things to me immediately, right? We got to fix all this stuff by next Monday. All right. Happy holidays.